Hello, welcome to the FME Server Month webinars for all things FME Server. My name is Samuel McDonald, and for this webinar, which is the first of four, we are going to go through an introduction to FME Server. Now, before I get started, I'm going to quickly introduce myself in a little more detail. I feel it is important to set a better impression than the initial impression that I generally get of, geez, that guy has a fair bit of facial hair. Picture for point of reference. I'm an electronic engineer who works for Sales.australia as one of their senior consultants, primarily working on delivering FME-oriented solutions to various clients. If anyone watching this webinar is interested in contacting me with regard to the various FME products or delivering solutions in FME and so on, feel free to contact me via the email that you see on the screen. Additionally, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. With that out of the way, let's take a look at what to expect over the coming weeks. The FME Server Month webinars consist of 4 webinars in total, covering a series of topics selected by the technical staff here at OneSpatial. Our starting point is an introduction to FME Server, an overall guide to what FME Server offers, which we will cover as part of this webinar. Our second topic is self-service, putting the power in your users' hands with easy to set up self-service portals. Our third topic is enterprise integration, integrating FME Server with new and existing integration patterns. And finally, our fourth topic is dynamic engines and scaling, making the most of FME Server's flexibility to cut costs and improve performance. The intention of these webinars is to provide a good insight into the benefits of FME Server and how it can be used to deliver commonly requested broad spectrum features as we see here. So, I guess the best question to be asking now is, what is FME Server? I'm not going to assume that everyone attending this webinar is aware of what this product achieves, and I think this is a worthwhile question to be asking. Ultimately, FME Server is a web-based platform that brings your workbenches from FME Desktop into an online environment. Now, the significance of this is that it provides a centralized solution for FME workbenches, something that is difficult to achieve with FME Desktop alone. Users will find ease of access to workflows is far simpler with FME Server through the easy-to-use web interface. FME Server provides many options to automate your workflows via schedules and event-based triggers, and can easily chain multiple workbenches into larger workflows. It also provides options for securing your workflows with user permissions and roles, and encryption for data transits. Finally, it is possible to configure FME Server in fault-tolerant configurations that can continue to be scaled as required. A common question we at OneSpatial get is how FME Desktop and FME Server compare. Generally, people are rightly curious what FME Server is going to do for them that FME Desktop isn't already doing. Now, depending on your requirements, the answer is potentially quite a lot. And to understand this, a quick comparison of the two products is in order. Now, let's start with FME Desktop, which we typically refer to as the developer's tool. FME Desktop is a wonderful tool that allows users to design integration workflows without code, supporting a wide range of formats and transformations. This is done through the very intuitive drag and drop approach to defining logic, with FME's large range of different transformers. To get started, one simply needs to open Desktop and start typing the name of a transformer to find it, drop the transformer and set the parameters of it accordingly. In the example that is currently on the screen, I'm defining a simple bit of logic to read in a shapefile that has all the countries in the world and implement a user-defined list that allows users to filter the file based on continent. The process will then write out a shapefile that only contains the selected continents and log the continents that were excluded. To do this in code would be a far more daunting task, and it really is a testament to SAFE's commitment to providing ease of use and support for a wide range of formats. However, there is a potential downside here. Once I have completed this workflow, I may want to make it available to my colleagues or the general populace. But how can I realistically do this in FME Desktop, the tool that is designed for the developer fundamentally? As far as my colleagues are concerned, I could probably provide the finished workbench, given that we have a licensed server for FME Desktop and are currently financing enough licenses for the entire team. But what if you don't need that many desktop licenses? Or what if your clients and the general populace don't have FME Desktop? As lovely as this workflow being defined is, the drawback for the use of it is that there is a licensing requirement for all users involved, not just the host, if you use FME Desktop. Additionally, I would have to share the workbenches directly, which has security concerns related to the integrity of the workflow and its outputs. The reality is, FME Desktop is a developer tool, and it's not really geared towards the general user experience of submitting and receiving data. Luckily, FME Server is. As I mentioned earlier, FME Server is a platform to host your FME Desktop workbenches online. But in reality, it goes so much further than that. It isn't just designed to host your workbenches online, it's designed to support and elevate them beyond the capabilities of FME Desktop alone, the specifics of which we will be getting into shortly. This really makes FME Server shine as a centralized and efficient user experience, which supports many connections and triggers to automate and invoke your workflows that have been designed in FME Desktop. It is because of the fact that FME Server is designed to complement FME Desktop that I think we need to rethink this screen a little bit. There we go. That's better. A little more reflective of the relationship between FME Desktop and FME Server. FME Server is the platform of choice for housing and automating the workflows that you design in FME Desktop. Now, don't get me wrong, for the most part, this doesn't change how you use FME Desktop, how you're familiar with it. You still use the canvas to design a workflow, as was shown earlier, being able to source input data from different files, different databases, different online resources, and so on. Typically, you will transform this data in some manner and spit it out into your format of choice. One of the biggest strengths of FME Desktop is its staggering format support, with over 450 formats being supported. This hasn't changed. What does change is the environment that this workflow will operate within. You can almost think of FME Server as the wrapper to wrap up each of your workflows with. Publishing these workflows to FME Server offers many benefits, including, but not limited to, allowing users ease of access to the workflow via the web interface, REST API, or server apps to upload or download data, triggering processes from messages and subsequently publishing messages, defining schedules to trigger workflows and events, improving the ease of connectivity to other existing systems within an infrastructure to integrate with the overall architecture more efficiently, providing many means of accessing the desired workflows through different devices, tablets, phones, and so on, and all through a platform that offers many security advantages that you really would expect to see as part of a web-based solution. The analogy that I tend to make in my head here is it's the whole raw code versus compiled code, or a compiled solution. You don't typically provide your raw code to your clients and users, as it can be altered and manipulated easily and may be downright difficult to navigate. You compile it and you distribute it to simplify the end user's experience with your product, while also protecting the source code it is based on. That is basically what FME Server will do for you and your solutions. You will provide a secure environment to house your solutions on that will also provide a really clean ease of use for your users. Alright, I've talked a bit about why you should be interested in FME Server, so let's start taking a closer look at what makes up an FME Server installation and what different installation options you have if you choose to install it. FME Server has 6 main components that comprise the standard installation. Firstly, we have the Java Web Application Server. This is the servlet that will provide users access to the web user interface and additionally run the installation's web services as well. It is a Tomcat servlet by default, but custom servlets can be used for more advanced installation types if you so choose. Secondly, we have the FME Server core. I like to think of the core as the brains of the installation, as it is the primary component for managing job requests, handling scheduling, and repository contents. The FME Server core is what will engage other components, such as the FME Server engines, as required to carry out requested functionality. Thirdly, we have the server job queue. Simply put, this is the service that handles job queues and prioritization. If FME Server has more job requests than capacity to run them, it will queue them until resources become available to run them. Fourthly, we have the FME Server engines. These components are what process job requests by running the FME workspaces. When it comes to how many jobs you can run concurrently and how efficiently they will run, this component will be your main consideration for service specifications and quantity. Each engine will process a single job at a time in a manner that is fairly comparable to how FME Desktop runs translations, without that pretty interface to watch the features flow through. Fifthly, we have the system database, which is used to store information related to the overall installation. This includes jobs, active, queued, and running, repositories, automations, schedules, credentials, which are soldered and hashed, and so on. By default, this is a Postgres database, but other database types are supported. Sixthly, and finally, we have the system share, which is used to store published workspace files, log files, data shares, and so on. The distinction between the system database and the system share is that the former is related to the configuration of the installation, while the latter is the directory structure to store required files. Now that we understand these fundamental components, let's take a look at how they fit together. FME Server comes with a range of installation options for users that configure the aforementioned components differently depending on the user's needs. The simplest of these installation types is the Express installation. It's in the name. Basically, it will install all of the mentioned components on the same server instance. This even includes the database server, meaning that there is little work required from the user's end to get started with FME Server. Given that everything is installed on the same instance, this installation type only requires the single server to get up and running. It really is quick and easy. If you want to get started very quickly with FME Server, Express installation is the way to go. FME Server also supports different tiers of distributed installations, if users so choose to take advantage of it. Individual components can be installed on separate instances to each other, which can be beneficial if you are looking to have each of the components and servers be managed by the appropriate team. If you've got particular expertise in particular areas, you want to separate this out. You may also desire a finer control over applying security updates to the individual components. In its simplest form, a distributed installation involves the system share and the system database being installed on separate instances, which is shown in the image on the right. A really popular choice, however, for distributed installations is to also have distributed engines, installing engines on separate server instances. Separating your engines out on their own servers can help you tailor your server requirements to meet the bulk of your processing needs. Additionally, it can be scaled easily by requisitioning additional servers with the distributed engines. The FME Server installer provides options to perform distributed installations and distributed engine installations, making this process relatively easy. Finally, we have fault-tolerant installations. Now, technically, the fault-tolerant deployment for FME Server is just another distributed deployment, but it deserves its own slide. All fault-tolerant deployments are distributed deployments, but not all distributed deployments are fault-tolerant deployments. Anyway, planning for fault tolerance with FME server installations is very well supplemented by the installer and really makes removing single points of failure an easy task. To enable a fault-tolerant deployment, you need a minimum of 2 systems with FME installed on both. Each of these systems uses the same system share and system database that provide common points for files and configurations respectively. An additional requirement for a fault-tolerant deployment is a load balancer, which I believe Safe's recommendation for this is an F5, just FYI, that what this load balancer will do, it monitors system health and distributes the web requests between the FME server environments. The deployments are an active-active arrangement, meaning all server hosts are active at the same time during normal operation. Now, there's quite a lot of flexibility when it comes to the distributed deployments. The deployment shown on the right is Safe's recommendation for straightforward fault tolerance with 2 full installations, which include the core, engine, web server, and queue, share the same database and the same system share. But this is ultimately up to the users on how they want to deploy. Options exist to have distributed engines and distributed web servers, which is now shown on the right. These can be expanded to include more core installations, more distributed engines, and so on. Basically, the installer will give you the flexibility to tailor your own deployment to your needs. I fear that if I don't start actually using FME Server soon, people are going to realize that they aren't simply here because they like the sound of my voice. As flattering as that would be, so I really should jump into it. When logging into the web user interface, you are presented with a fairly simple login prompt. I'm just going to go ahead and log into my super secure admin account right now. Once you've logged in, you're generally going to be greeted with a series of panels that provide up-to-date information on recent events, recently published workspaces, and so on. In this instance, it's actually quite bare because this is a new installation. The only thing that we really have is the last published workspaces, and that's because FME Server ships with sample workspaces and a few utilities to get you started really quickly. On the left, we have a list of features that we're going to be taking a look at. Starting at the top, we have Run Workspace, which, as the name suggests, is simply running a workspace like you would in Desktop. Secondly, we have automations, which are native workflows in FME Server to trigger events. Next is Streams, which is a service that allows jobs to be run continuously. Schedules, which will allow you to trigger events at specified times and intervals. Jobs, where you can review all running, queued, and completed jobs and their logs. Workspaces, where you can go through the workbench directory stored on the system share. Workspace Viewer, a tool for reviewing published workspaces or workbenches. Server apps, where you can customize web pages to run workbenches through. Projects, where you can bring together items into groups for ease of management. Files and connections, where you can manage your shared resources and web and database connections. User management, which is related to user permissions and role permissions and Active Directory connections. System configuration, where the majority of your options live. Backup and restore, which is exactly as the name suggests. And finally, engine management, where engines, queues, and rules can be managed. Now, what I'm going to do is go into each of these individual items in a bit more depth, starting with Workspaces. In Workspaces, we can review the contents of the repositories that store the workbenches and perform a number of actions on them. At this stage, we actually haven't created any repositories or published any workbenches in this new installation. So let's take a quick look at doing so with the workbench from earlier in the presentation. Back on the canvas now, it is very straightforward to publish a workbench. We just need this large Publish button at the top right here. Click on that, and you'll come up with this pop-up box. FME Server and FME Desktop uses a saved web connection to authenticate the publish via the REST API. If a connection hasn't been configured, because as you can see, I've got my personal server configured here, it can easily be done via the connection drop-down box by selecting the Add Web Connection. You'll get another pop-up, fill in the credentials here, authenticate it, and you should be good to go. Since mine's already been done and already been set up, I'm going to skip this. Click Next. And here we're presented with a list of existing repositories if we want to publish to those. Now, in this instance, we've only got the default ones, and I don't particularly want to publish to any of these. I want to create a new one for this occasion, and I can do so via this UI. Simply select New, define a repository name, which we're going to go Demo, and a description if you want, Demo for demo purposes. Click OK, and it's successfully created Demo. Once this is done, and we click Next, just confirming that I've got my workbench named as I want, and that the files that it's expecting, we can actually directly upload those, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to upload them as part of running the workspace, which we'll see shortly. Click Next. Once you're done, you'll be met with this list of services that you can register. Registering different services allows the same workbench to operate in different ways. Job Submitter is the very basic service that simply submits a job to run as is. In a lot of instances, this is all that you will need. Data Download provides an option for users to receive a download link for output data. Data Streaming provides an option for streaming the output directly to another workflow service and such. The KML network link allows use with the Google Earth 3D viewer, and the notification service provides options for notifying internal FME topics. For this demonstration, I'm just going to select Job Submitter, and I'm going to select Data Download. And as part of the data download, I'm just going to make sure that the writers that are included in the download are there. We've only got the one writer, it's output shapefile. Excellent. Hit Publish. And that should be all you need to do. And if you just want to check the log, you confirm that it's been successfully published. So, coming back to the Workspaces page in FME Server, we can see that we've got a new repository called Demo, which definitely sounds familiar. The description on it is Demo for demo purposes. That definitely sounds like my wording. So excellent, we've created a repository. Open it up, and excellent, we can see that we've got a workbench in here called Continent Filter, which is exactly what we published. Now, from this here, we can actually do a few things if we so choose. We can go ahead and unstar it or star it if we want, go straight to the View Workspace. We could download it if we want. We can see if there's any files related to it, but there aren't because I didn't upload them. We can go directly to running it, which we'll get to. We can upload to this repository from here as well. There's plenty of things that we can do. But the main point of this is that we've successfully created a repository and uploaded a workbench for this FME Server instance to use, and it was very straightforward. So with that in mind, I think we're going to go ahead to the next step, which is to run a workspace. Over to the Run Workspace page now, and the first thing we need to do is actually find a workspace to run. So we need to select a repository, and the repository that we're interested in is the one I created, Demo. The workspace is Continent Filter. It's the only option we've got here, so great, let's use it. And the service. So we registered two services, Job Submitter and Data Download, and they're both here, which is great. Data Download's what I'm after. I want to be able to just download my data directly from a link. Now, we have two relevant user parameters here. The first one was this parameter that I created, a list that lets you select which continents you want to keep. So I'm going to be completely biased, that biased guy from Australia, and go, I like Oceania. And we'll throw in Antarctica too. And secondly, we need to specify the input shapefile to be read. Now, this was previously just set to a hard location on my computer, but I don't want to do that. I want to be able to do with something a little more self-service. So I'm just going to drop this in. Excellent. And all we need to do once we've done that, we've uploaded our file, we've specified a parameter, is click the run button. And that will run. And you'll get a little bit of an active status on where it's at in currently. And that's completed successfully. And what we have here is our data download URL. So if I go ahead and open that, I have something that I can download, which is great. Additionally, if I want to actually review the details of this job run, I just need to click view details, and you basically get an inline feed of the job log, similar to what you would expect in the console in FME Desktop. You can download the log from here, you can resubmit it, and just like the workspaces, you can view the workspace, or you can download the workspace. It gives you quite a few options, it gives you quite a bit of information, but the main point here is that as far as very basic functionality, it's incredibly easy just to get in and run a workspace in FME Server. The next topic that I'm going to cover is a rather important one, which is files and connections. Now, starting with connections. Connections are FME's way of storing information for web connections and for database connections. These named connections basically are stored so that when workbenches need to authenticate these connections, they don't actually have to have those credentials embedded in them. They can reference these named connections. If you wanted to add a new connection in FME Server, all you need to do is click on the one that you want, click new, and start defining what you want. In this case, quickly for database connection, I could define one called demo, do a Postgres, and occupy the details for the Postgres database. Same with the web connection, with some variances here and there as to basically around what kind of web connection that you're trying to connect to. It's really quite straightforward. The other way of actually publishing connections to FME Server is if a workbench is being published with a connection that's in use that actually isn't already in that FME Server instance, FME Server will give you the option to publish, FME Desktop will give you the option to publish that connection as part of the process of publishing the workbench. So if you don't already have it in server, it will give you the option at the time. Secondly, we've got resources. And basically what this is your shared resource folders, which by default, these are the ones that are on the system share. And these are basically known network locations that FME Server has to store data. Now, we've got a data folder here, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new folder here and call it data for continents. Because last time I ran the workbench for the continents one, I actually had to upload the file, which is fine, but I don't have to do that all the time. I don't suspect that these files are going to change, so why do I need to keep uploading it? So I'm going to create a resource folder for this under data for continents, and I'm actually just going to directly upload this data just so that I've got a static file set that I can reference. And let's just chuck that in now. So I can just drag and drop those in. And then when I go back and actually run this, funnily enough, all I can do is I can just click this browse resources, data for continents, and there it is. For something that I'm potentially using over and over, this is a much quicker approach than having to actually upload every single time. But it really is a per case thing. If you're going to have a self-service portal or something that people upload different data every time, this may not be a good solution. If you've got reference files or static data, this is a brilliant way to do it. The next thing on my agenda is to schedule some time to talk about schedules. It was a terrible joke, I know, but I'm powering on. So, schedules are a fairly straightforward way of defining intervals or periods of time during the day to execute workbenches instead of just manually running the workspace. So, to start with a schedule, we'll create a new schedule. We'll just name it demo. We have to give it a category. And we'll pull that demo as well, just to be completely uninspired. And For the schedule type, we have a few options here. Basic is just defining a start and end time and the recurrence rate. Repeat an interval basically lets us repeat an interval, like define an interval. Cron expressions are a means of defining an expression that you can actually dictate intervals during the day, year, month, whatever that it will actually operate on, and only occur once is it will only occur once. Let's do on interval. We're going to repeat once a day. The start time we're going to start immediately, and the end time we're actually going to expire in a week. And that's what we need for that. The workspace we need to define pretty much exactly the same as we did for run workspace. We need to define a repository and the workspace, which is already selected, and define the parameters. And we just need to make sure our parameters are set correctly for the input data, which we're going to use our data that we've put on the shared drive and our output location on the same drive. And that's all you need. It's really that simple. Click OK, and that's done. And you can even quickly reference if it's view the triggered jobs, and we've seen that it has triggered. So it's triggered just as we've created it. And it's really that simple. And if you want to go ahead and manage your schedules, all you need to do is select manage schedules, select the ones you want to do, and you'll get a whole drop down list of things you can do, whether you want to disable it, which I'm not interested in it running anymore, enable it, remove it, duplicate it, trigger it, so on and so forth. They really are quite straightforward. Next, I'd like to talk about the job section of FME Server, a handy little resource that actually lets you review the status of completed jobs, queued jobs, and running jobs. Now, all three of these are pretty much the same, just the variance is the point in time that they occurred. So we can see our continent filter jobs that have run previously, and we can actually see the one that came from the schedule, the demo, where these other ones were run manually because they don't have a source name, whereas this actually has a source. Queued jobs, I don't expect to see any queued jobs. Running jobs, I don't expect to see any running jobs. But the layout will be the same. And basically from the jobs page, if you want to inspect the log, which this should look familiar from Run Workspace, you can basically go through and check everything. It's a really, really handy tool when you're developing, when you're debugging, when you just want to know what's actually going on. And we actually have some warnings in here, so you can filter on warnings too, which I can see the loggers just basically, I've logged these manually saying that these continents are being excluded, which is just awful. You shouldn't exclude anyone. On to one of my favorite things in FME Server, automations. Automations are basically the native workflow in FME Server. They're workflows that you can apply as a top level to your workflows. It's like workflow inception. It's brilliant. What you've basically got is you've got these little very nifty little workflows. I'm going to keep saying workflows a lot. The idea of automations is you have three key components. You have your triggers, you have your actions, and you have your external actions, and everything else being sort of things that you can do to clean up your automation. A trigger is something that responds to a message. This could be that you have a directory modified, you've received an email, you've had a topic notified, the list goes on. I could do a topic notified, and if, let's say there's a sample topic, we could say if the sample topic actually got notified. Next, I could add a action. I'm actually going to run a workspace, and I'm going to go straight back to demo and run continent filter, and we know where the data for this is. So let's run it, and we're going to just dump the output right back where we were previously. Done. That's going to run a workspace. And let's say the workspace finishes successfully. We actually are going to then, we could do anything. I'll send an email to someone and I would occupy this, which I'm not going to do right now, but we could send an email to, just occupy it with test and test. No, it doesn't like it. Yep. Test and test. There you go. It's going to complain if I run it, but basically we could email someone, and if it fails, we could email someone else. These basically allow you to define top level workflows that really put an edge on your overall patterns. And we'll be covering this in a lot more detail during the enterprise integration talk. Now, unfortunately, I can't cover everything that I had in the list in the time span of this webinar. So the last thing that I'm going to cover is user management, the ability to set permissions for users and roles, to connect to AD, and to set the permissions for individual items in FME Server. It's a great tool to know about. So let's begin with users. So we can control the permissions of users. We can enable or disable them. And you'll notice that the only account enabled is admin because I don't need any of these other default accounts. I've been lazy and only had admin, so if I wanted to, I could actually create my account for me, as I probably should. So Donald, email, that. And I can assign security roles to myself, and I'm pretty special, so I'm going to make myself a super user, and it gives me a warning saying the super user is very powerful. Do you trust this person? I think I'm trustworthy. And I can just set a password for that. If I wanted to, I could force them to change their password in the next login, but this is my password, so I'm going to use it. And if I wanted to as well, I could go through and actually select each individual permission and give them access to this and this and this. However, I've selected super user and everything's granted by super user. Excellent. I've created a new user. Roles. Now the roles, as far as the permissions are concerned, work very similar to how we just saw for the user. A role basically is something that users can be assigned to, and they adopt permissions from that instead of being individually assigned. You can do hybrids. You can have a role that someone's assigned to, but they also have an elevated permission for a couple of things that's individually assigned to their account. So if we were going to create a new role, we would create the name, and we could do the same thing where we just go through and select each individual element. If I wanted to, I could just create a run the workspace person. And if we went to run workspace, and they can access run workspace, and we create that. And now we have a role called run the workspace person with no one assigned to it, but we know it's there. Items is a way of actually going through and checking permissions and assigning permissions of individual items. So for example, if we went to our schedules, we created a schedule earlier called demo. The owner and user are admin. That user I created just before actually doesn't have access to it, so I can grant access to it if I want. Full access to Sam McDonald. Done. Sam McDonald now has access to it. And Active Directory is relatively easy to connect. Basically just come into the Active Directory, click New, and define what kind of directory and start occupying details with your connection encryptions and your authentication type and so on and so forth. And once you've got this connected, you'll be able to actually import your users, and you're actually able to map Active Directory groups to roles as well. So you can define roles that basically a group that comes from Active Directory are basically adopt those permissions from that role. There's one last thing that I want to talk about, which is FME Cloud. I've been talking about FME Server for a while now, and hopefully I've generated some interest in demographic of people who are watching this, who are sitting there and going, potentially, this is really cool and I really want to go on board with this, but I can't really justify the price. Well, this is where FME Cloud may be the solution for you. FME Cloud is basically FME Server on the cloud. It is a hosted deployment option for FME Server, similar to an EC2 service that Safe themselves will actually spin up. It doesn't require hardware or resources on the user's end to support FME Server. That hardware is requisitioned as part of the process. The setup is far simpler than the standard FME Server setup, and the configuration to actually get running is really straightforward. And most importantly, it has a pay-as-you-go model, which means that you only ever pay for what you need. You only pay based on the instance size, the instance space, and how many engines you're using and runtime. Whereas compared to FME servers, flat pricing per license. So knowing this, the question you might ask yourself is, well, now do I want FME server or cloud, and what's the benefit or downside of each? And honestly, the answer is it depends on your requirements. FME server has some advantages that FME cloud doesn't, and vice versa. FME server can be installed on premise or it can be cloud hosted. You can install it directly onto EC2 instances or other cloud hosted instances, or you can install it directly on premise, whereas FME Cloud will only ever be cloud hosted. However, for FME Server, you need to requisition and provide the hardware, whereas the hardware is included as part of FME Cloud. FME Server has, let's call it, moderately complex setup requirements when compared to FME Cloud, which is very simple setup requirements. However, FME Server does have Windows and Linux support, whereas FME Cloud only has Linux support. And where that will potentially become a problem is if you need to work with formats such as Esri geodatabases, for example, because the third-party libraries aren't supported on Linux, so they're not supported on FME Cloud. Finally, and probably the biggest consideration for people is that FME Server has a license pricing model versus FME Cloud's pay-as-you-go pricing model. So FME Cloud, as far as an entry into FME Server is concerned, is a lot more cost-effective. Both of them have trial periods that you can actually sign up for. But as far as slightly longer-term use, FME Cloud may be a better option for people, given the cost effectiveness of it. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention it as part of this presentation. It's still FME Server. It's just FME Server provided in a different way and priced a different way. So knowing this, users can make their decision. And if at any point you have questions about what's best, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this presentation. I hope it's been beneficial and educational for the majority of people here. And as mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.